Poštovane kolege, koleginice, dobar dan. Ja ću sada produžiti na engleskom kako ne bi se ovo pretvorilo u neki stand-up comedy show. There are three reasons I'm really happy to be here today with you, and thank you, Professor Mimica, for the invitation. The first reason is that I'm here on Brač in Supetar after, I think, 13, 14 years, and in my hippocampal regions, I have really pleasant memories, so I will refresh them now so that I don't lose them. The second reason is that over the past 2 years, I've met most of you over the Zoom meetings and met you just only on screen, so after a long time, we are gathering together in person. And the third reason that I'm really happy to be part of this meeting is that I believe is the only conference that has this holistic approach and puts the person with dementia in the center and gathering all these interprofessional teams together discussing on the same topic. So congratulations on that, Professor Mimica. I've been to other meetings, and this is the first one having people with dementia in the center. The title of my topic, though, might not seem that we will have this holistic approach, renaming and reframing dementias to cognitive proteinopathies in the era of biomarkers. But even though it may sound like a basic science and talking on biomarkers, it is actually a person-centered approach. And the picture you see I use in a lot of my presentations is the picture that's haunting me over the years, and is from one meeting, the ADPD meeting in Vienna, 2017. One of the meetings where scientists from all over the world gathered together to talk on very basic pathophysiological mechanisms of dementia, neurodegenerative disorders. They talk about this transgenic animal models, the translational approach of the science into clinical practice. But everywhere in front of the conference theaters, we could see all these faces staring at us, reminding us that this basic science we are doing is for these people, for people living with dementia. And from a clinical perspective, these people want to know what's happening to them. What's happening to me? That's the question they ask, or the family asks that question. And we clinicians simply diagnose. And if you look at the dictionary, what does it mean to diagnose, is to identify the nature of an illness by examination of symptoms. And that's what we are doing. So our journey today, I will start with the clinician's perspective, the way we think, then add some pinch of dementia history, and end by renaming, the necessity of renaming dementias into cognitive proteinopathies to come to these new emerging classifications of dementia, and of course the biomarkers which would lead us toward the future precision medicine and precision treatments. So what is our clinician's perspective? A very simplified view. We have a patient presenting symptom and signs. We may or may not know what exactly is the cause of this disease, but we have this working diagnosis. We do the clinical examination, we perform some tests and come to a diagnosis and treatment. So this is a very simplified approach. And if we have this on mind, let me just share the story of this 86-year-old female which presents an amnestic cognitive impairment. So when you have an 86-year-old patient with amnestic cognitive impairment, and if I show you the MRI that shows, this is not my patient, it's from the literature, show you that there is a severe hippocampal atrophy, I believe that most of you would agree with me that this is a probable Alzheimer's disease. It's probable because we do not have all the biomarkers. So the way clinician thinks is according to the clinical phenotype, we can identify the localization. We know the functional neuroanatomy. So if someone presents with personality and personality changes, social behavior, has problems with initiative, with language problems, that would lead us to frontotemporal regions, and we would think of frontotemporal degeneration. And when someone presents as this lady with memory problems or disorientation, we would think probably of the temporal lobe and parietal lobe that would lead us to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So these schemes, they are different, the percentages are different, but this is what we think. We use these clusters of classified dementia when looking at our patients, so we put them into categories. It's either Alzheimer's, vascular, or dementia with Lewy bodies, which we heard about. So what does the clinical phenotype tell us? It tells us where. It is the GPS, the clinical phenotypes and the current clinical dementia diagnosis recognize where the pathology may be found, but not what is the pathology in the brain. And it is quite important because of this, because of the treatment is targeting what, not where. So a week ago, when we were on a similar meeting in Rijeka, the last date was announced that lecanemab, one of the monoclonal antibodies targeting amyloid beta, has this confirmatory phase 3 studies, and the primary results were satisfactory. And most of the drugs in the drug discovery pipeline for Alzheimer's dementia target proteins. They're monoclonal antibodies, so we have to know what is the underlying pathology. And now I promised that I would add a pinch of dementia history. You see, Alzheimer, 116 years ago, on a similar meeting, maybe like this one, presented the case of Augusta. He presented the clinical phenotype very precisely, but here he had this advantage to know what is the underlying pathology. Of course, maybe he didn't know the exact proteins, but he had these drawings, he had this opportunity to perform the neuropathological examination of Augusta's brain. So he knew what's inside Augusta's brain more than we do in everyday clinical practice. You saw Frederick Louis. I thought that we should know how these people look like, at least because we are using their names for naming this dementia, and Professor Bogdanovic showed you Frederick Louis, and this is Arnold Pick. But Alzheimer's was the one who described the Pick's bodies while analyzing his cases. So they knew and they identified the pathology. And from their work and the work of many other scientists afterwards, we know that all these neurodegenerative dementias are caused of protein misfolding and aggregation. So again, a very simplified but a practical approach for a clinician is that, as we all know, in Alzheimer's disease there is the main actor, beta amyloid and tau. Frontotemporal degenerations, there are multiple proteins, mainly tau, TDP43, and Lewy body, of course, the alpha-synuclein in the Lewy bodies. And then, if we have this broader picture, as we started, we know that there are genetic risk factors, there are environmental factors, there is this complex pathophysiology, and then when we identify the clinical phenotype, it looks like Alzheimer's disease. We can now guess what is the underlying proteinopathy. Is it amyloid beta and tau for Alzheimer's disease, Lewy bodies for PD and dementia, or Lewy body disease, and tau TDP43 for frontotemporal dementia. And yes, we have these classifications we use that describe the clinical phenotype of the neurodegenerative patient with light reference to the etiology. But we need detailed information. We need this classification to evolve and to identify the cognitive proteinopathy because of this. If we do not understand that, if we cannot find a way to see what's happening in the brain, we won't be able to have treatments in future. And it started. This is the game changer in understanding Alzheimer's disease, the research framework that was published in 2018. So now from a syndromal concept, Alzheimer's disease is understood as a biological construct with very specifically identified biomarkers. And you've already probably heard about the A10 classification. It's not that new. So this classification is a classification regardless of the clinical phenotype. If someone has amyloid and tau, and if there is, again, neurodegeneration, it is Alzheimer's disease. But there is this Alzheimer's continuum. So anyone that has amyloid in the brain goes into Alzheimer's continuum. It was until very soon called that it is the preclinical, presymptomatic stage. So we were in a way to predict or to identify a disease in the brain before the clinical symptoms. But now they are considered to be just risk factors, people with very high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. How can we see? We do not have the opportunity as Alzheimer and Professor Bogdanovic did, and we do not want to perform autopsy to our patients. We want them to stay alive as long as possible, but to know what's happening in the brain. And of course, as you might guess, the biomarkers. These are the window to the brain's pathology. There are the CSF biomarkers, the neuroimaging biomarkers, and there are some new. We want to have something that is really easily accessible, cheap if possible. We are looking for the blood biomarkers, and maybe Professor Pirtošek had a nice talk a week ago for using the eye as a window to the brain and using the retinal biomarkers. So A in this ATN classification stands for brain amyloidosis. How can we see if there is amyloid in the brain? We can perform amyloid PET, or a cheaper diagnostic procedure. We can analyze the CSF for lowering amyloid beta 42. The tau pathology, there is now tau PET. I'm not sure if in Croatia you have tau PET, but of course the increase of p-tau in the CSF is really easily accessible. And then neurodegeneration, the total tau in the CSF, but something that everyone can perform in every city, even in Macedonia, structural MRI and FDG PET for exploring the neurodegeneration. So these are the tools we have, and all these biomarkers are not found in one patient all at once. It depends on the time sequencing of events. So here on this slide, you can see the evolution of these biomarkers. Really early, the first detectable change is lowering of A-beta, then there is the phospho-tau, and then the neurodegeneration with all the procedures. Even the cognitive tests can be used as a biomarker and a diagnostic tool quite early, so we do not have to wait. But this seems perfect. But of course, I was just mentioning amyloid and tau and neurodegeneration. And I mentioned some other proteins there which cannot be assessed by these CSF or imaging biomarkers. We see only what we are looking for. So we do not make tests to see what are all the proteins that have been deposited in the brain. There is now a new emerging biomarker, neurofilament light change, that is a promising one to be the biomarker of neurodegeneration in the whole spectrum of neurodegenerative diseases, but unfortunately still not in clinical practice, at least in our country. So let's go back to this 86-year-old female that has amnestic cognitive impairment, and I show you one of the imaging biomarkers. There is a severe hippocampal atrophy. We agree that it is a probable Alzheimer's disease, and of course at 86 I would probably not perform the CSF. I do not have the amyloid PET, and I would guess, since there is this neurodegeneration, having the time evolution of the disease, that probably this patient, if I do the coding, would be A+, T+, M+. So we are moving from neurodegenerative dementias to cognitive proteinopathies, and we are replacing where to what? We saw where the hippocampal is the reason why she has amnestic problems, but what is the cause? They did somewhere else, they did the biomarkers, and what was shown that she's amyloid negative and tau negative, so she's A-, T-, just M+. So it's not probable Alzheimer's disease according to this classification. She has something else. It is late. Limbic predominant age-related TDP-43, we know now the protein encephalopathy. So we are diving now at something which is a lecture for itself, the suspected non-Alzheimer's disease pathophysiology, and we have the expert here, Professor Bogdanovic, is talking on this topic. But we are opening a whole new cluster of neurodegenerative disorders that till now probably we've put them into one of our usually used categories. But if we go back now again to the history, I would like to show you what Alzheimer himself wrote into this article about a peculiar disease of the cerebral cortex that Kraepelin later named as Alzheimer's disease. So he said that we should not let ourselves be satisfied with trying to include any clinically unclear illness case into one of the diagnostic entities known to us. So we are the one that created these diagnostic entities. And that we will gradually arrive at a stage when we will be able to separate out individual diseases from large illness categories of our textbook. So I think it is the time. We have arrived to that time, but things in a neurodegenerative field and dementia field are not black and white. So the real world has a lot of shades. And as you can see here, it's not only amyloid, it's not only tau, but what else? 2/3 of patients with dementia show comorbid pathology. They have Lewy bodies, they have TDP-43, they have vascular pathology. And this, having this picture on mind, where at the same picture we have Alzheimer himself and Frederick Lewy, let it be a reminder that in our patients' brains, those that even present with Alzheimer's disease, there is a comorbid proteinopathy. And we can discuss why there are several diseases associated with accumulation of multiple types of proteins. Different theses, it will take time until we understand the exact pathophysiology, but it might be that these protein degradation pathways for multiple types of proteins are simultaneously affected, that the misfolding and accumulation of one type of protein promotes abnormalities to the metabolism of other proteins, that we know that beta amyloid peptides enhance alpha-synuclein accumulation, that alpha-synuclein then induces fibrillation of tau protein. So just as a reminder, one protein can be found in many diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, and one disease can have many proteins. And probably we are arriving at a time where we will not, according to the new classification, use the term dementia, but regarding the treatment options, we should look at them as proteinopathies. And these overlapping circles here should just remind us that there is an overlap of these categories that we've used till now to make things easier for clinicians. And as I mentioned, the clinicians, let's go back to this clinician's perspective. If we go back now and face to face with our patients, what should we do? We should think of proteins or the clinical phenotype. So the role of the clinician will still be really important. Of course, we cannot perform the biomarkers and see what's happening in everyone's brain in everyday clinical practice. But we should be really good at decoding the core phenotypes. So the role of clinician will be maybe even more important than previous. We should be able to identify these core phenotypes. So if someone has executive dysfunction, attentional abnormalities, fluctuations, visual hallucinations, and Parkinsonism, this would lead us, yes, Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and it will be on our mind, okay, the Lewy bodies, the alpha-synuclein protein. And this is, again, very simplified, but this is the way we would think. If we now go to an advanced stage, we would identify, of course, first the syndrome. That's what was written in the old textbooks. We should recognize the syndrome, then really describe the clinical phenotypes. So, for example, for Alzheimer's diseases, there are these topographically atypical variants. I think Professor Klippert will talk on these. So we should recognize and then have in mind that there could be amyloid beta, there could be tau, but also there could be TDP-43, there could be alpha-synuclein. Why? Because when we think of neurodegenerative disorders as cognitive proteinopathies, we could dive into the mechanism. So here on the left, you can see all these neurodegenerative diseases. We are still looking for a cure. We have drugs, as Professor Mimica said, but we do not have the cure. And all of these share probably some common pathophysiological mechanisms. It's either enhancement of production of these proteins or loss of clearance. But again, this is very simplified. If it was this simple, we would have the drugs by now. But we have to analyze these protein misfolding mechanisms, and then to make things even more complex, there is this combined theory in the neurodegenerative disorders where this small misfolded protein aggregates activate the innate immune system. So not only targeting the proteins, we should probably target the immune system in future. But for that, we have to have this molecular pathological classification of neurodegenerative diseases and turn towards a precision medicine, because we will have, hopefully soon, disease-modifying therapeutic strategies. And the importance of this protein-based classification and its translation first into vivo biomarkers to identify the protein would lead to specifically protein-centered approach in the treatment. So it will be probably the monoclonals will come, and the implication for treatment is still that the clinician must make decisions regarding the treatment based on the phenotype in the clinical setting. And in this situation, there's Jeffrey Cummings really nicely put the role of the clinician here. In this situation, clinical features that aid in identifying the specific associated prototype may eventually be of great assistance in choosing protein-specific therapeutic interventions. So the natural course of the disease goes from this side, from the left to the right. There is a genetic background, there are factors, environmental factors, modifiable, most of them, that target very vulnerable cell structures to vulnerable regions. There is this protein misfolding, biochemical modification, altered physiological function, and there is then this neurotransmitter disturbances we are targeting with the drugs we have now. And then there is the clinical phenotype. So all this happens before we see the clinical phenotype. But we clinicians will go to the other direction. We see the clinical phenotype, so from the right to the left, we think of the possible misfolded protein, then the localization we would know by the clinical phenotype, and arrive with the biomarkers to precise identification of the proteinopathy, and even maybe guess the genetic background. So this is in general for not only for dementias, but for the neurodegenerative diseases. And as for Alzheimer's disease, it is a multi-phase syndrome. So it's not going to be easy to differentiate just from clinical perspective. We will have to code A, T, N, I, probably add inflammation, and who knows how many letters more as more and more biomarkers are entering. So we will have to depict the underlying proteinopathy. We would have probably, hopefully soon, protein-targeted treatment, but we would have to target neuroinflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, add neuroprotection, possibly. We would have to use polygenic risk scores to predict. We would probably use omics, and things are really getting more and more complicated. And it is just for one purpose, to identify the original signature of the disease. That is the only path towards precision medicine. And as I'm coming to the end of my talk, tonight, congratulations on the idea, we will watch this movie. And there is a line that I really like and makes me feel upset, where the patient, Anthony Hopkins, in his role, says, "I feel as if I'm losing all my leaves." What is my feeling now, talking about the pathophysiological mechanisms of future clinical work and treatment, is that from the leaves, we cannot see the forest and the trees at the moment. But that is probably the path we have to walk together to get to the treatment. And I would just like to share and invite. It's kind of weird that I'm inviting you to a congress in Croatia, but maybe some of these unanswered questions, maybe we can discuss in the already world-known controversies in neurology that would take part in spring in beautiful Dubrovnik. Thank you for your attention.